Side note, Sandy, I am now the chair of the LGBTQA caucus, which on what I believe is the 10-year anniversary of the caucus.
I appreciate you making me feel that old.
You're welcome, and also thank you. Yeah, which is a longer conversation about where to go with the caucus now. But yeah, we had our meeting yesterday, and like 16 people showed up to a business meeting, an ISA LGBTQA business meeting at 9 p.m. GMT time. And I was like, wow, good job, us.
It's certainly a better feeling than getting mocked as a special interest group. So congratulations on that.
Yes, different time, different place.
Yeah.
But anyway. I think you were there, Emma. Did you go to the meeting yesterday? I think so. Not to call you out.
Did I do what?
Did you go to the meeting yesterday? I thought maybe I saw you at the LGBT.
Wednesdays are my super busy teaching days. I'm putting my camera on and off because I'm shoving food in my mouth before class starts. So not trying to be antisocial.
Okay, welcome everyone to Queer Politics webinar number 29. My name is Gabriele Magni. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And today I'm sitting in for Andy Reynolds. As most of you know, Andy hosts a webinar weekly. Today he cannot be with us. He says hi, and he will be back next week. So it's an exciting day to host today. We just had the Transgender Day of Visibility yesterday. And before introducing our speaker for today, and we are very lucky to have a great speaker, just a reminder of how the webinar works. There's going to be a presentation for about half an hour, and then there's going to be time for Q&As for about half an hour. If you want to ask a question, please send me a message in the chat. You don't need to type your question. You can just send me your name. This way, I know you want to ask a question. I can put you on the list, and then I can give you the floor and you can ask the question yourself. As usual, if you're able and feel comfortable turning your camera on, please feel free to do it so that we can see each other, but no need, no pressure, no need to do it if you prefer to keep it off. Okay, so today we are very lucky to have Dr. Jamie Hagen presenting. Dr. Jamie Hagen is a lecturer assistant professor in international relations at Queen's University Belfast. She's the founding co-director of the Center for Gender in Politics. Dr. Hagen's work is at the intersection of gender, security studies, and queer theory. Her scholarship focuses on the need to draw attention to queer people's experiencing conflict. In particular, her work explores how the Women, Peace and Security agenda can better include lesbian, bisexual, and trans women and sexuality more broadly in gender, peace, and security initiative. Dr. Hagen is a prolific scholar. She has a forthcoming book, Queer in Women, Peace and Security. She has published in outlets such as International Affairs, Critical Studies on Security, Exploring Violence Targeted at LGBTQ People in Conflict, and the importance of including LGBT organizations in the Colombia Peace Accords. She also published on the compounding risk for sex workers in the United States and the revolutionary possibilities of online trans and queer communities. Dr. Hagen's work bridges academic, activist, and policy approaches. She provides key recommendations to practitioners. She provided feedback to many organizations, including the UNDP, the UK National Action Plan, and she frequently engages in public scholarship through blog posts, podcast contribution, interviews, and expert comments. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Hagen, please, whenever you're ready.
Wow, thank you. That's maybe the best introduction I've ever gotten. It's taking me back to the first book chapter I did on the revolutionary possibilities of online communities after writing for Autostraddle. Anyway, thank you for that introduction, and really thrilled to be part of this series. I've enjoyed watching so many of the presentations, and also it's just really fantastic to see queer community space right now, which I'm very much missing. So I'm excited to see a lot of well, I will actually say familiar faces at this point after attending virtually some of the other talks. So I'm sitting in Belfast. I am a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast, and I'll be talking about the forthcoming book project, which I started thinking about queering women, peace, and security after working with a number of civil society organizations in New York City, so based in New York City. So the Global Network of Women Peace Builders and Peace Women. And I was really excited about the interventions that Women, Peace, and Security makes as an agenda, but frustrated at the cisgender and heteronormative assumptions that I was seeing in the reporting, but also just in the spaces that I was moving through in these civil society spaces, which then brought me into doing the work that I do as an academic, which is very much intended to speak to policy. So I will, I'll give a background on women, peace, and security, but also invite and really welcome feedback from the group here, as I know many people here are also engaged in thinking about LGBTQ policy questions. And I'm getting a spinning wheel over here, but hopefully my slides will be sharing shortly. Can anyone indicate if they can hear me right now? Because right now I'm getting an error on my side.
We can hear you.
Okay,
I think
great.
it's delayed, but
okay, great. So this was in 2014, 2015 that I started doing work on the civil society side, because I got a political science degree, and I was like, I want to do something thinking about international human rights, thinking about gender as a dimension of this. And so, as I said, I'll go through women, peace, and security as what the architecture is, thinking about queer women as a part of this. And I can speak a little bit about the interviews I've done as a way to sort of reflect on women, peace, and security in practice, and then sort of intersectional interventions to move through some of the cisgender and heteronormative assumptions in the discipline and practice, and really how thinking about queer peace building is a way through some of these limitations. So I love this photo, Queers for Peace. I do not know who these people are. If you do, please tell me. I would like to know. It's a photo that I found in the Lesbian Her Story archives. I did the thing where you go and you look at like the Beijing Women's Conference boxes and see what you can find about peace building. And this was one of the things that I found. But I'm, addressing heteronormative and cisgender assumptions in gender, peace, and security is one of the key contributions I'm seeking to make here, but also what does it mean to implement the women, peace, and security agenda intersectionally? So this is not, of course, this is not just about thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity. It's also about how are we confronting the racial hierarchies that are reproduced. And this is something that is relevant to all of the work that we're doing in terms of international human rights work and LGBTQ politics. So it's something that I think of with the lens of not reproducing the West, developing the rest within women, peace, and security. So this is something I'm thinking about as I'm making these interventions. And then what I'm seeing as the really exciting possibility and potentially way to sort of get through some of the frustrations at the limitations of what has been imagined as the women, peace, and security agenda, if we instead or also center queer reimaginings of peace and security. So sort of the quick, what is women, peace, and security? It started with this resolution in 2000, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and calls on states to ensure equal participation and full involvement of women in all peace and security efforts. And it's remarkable that it wasn't until the year 2000 that we have this resolution calling for this, right? And to me, the part that I really focus on is this call for gender perspectives and peace and security. And certainly as a lesbian feminist reading these resolutions, that to me means we need to be taking account for LGBTQ experiences as well, right? And when we think about a lot of the women, peace, and security agenda has been focusing on protecting women and girls from gender-based violence, recognizing that gendered violences are different forms of violence. And so this is something that the Women, Peace, and Security resolution is drawing attention to, but also seeking to respond to, right? So now we've got 20 years of women, peace, and security and 10 resolutions. None of them mention LGBTQ, none of them mention sexual orientation and gender identity. But as I say this, and I'm thinking about some of the other talks that I've heard in this series too, we know just because it didn't end, we know just that we can't just look at the language that actually makes it through, right? We know that there were conversations that happened where lesbians are very much a part of this work and advocated for a more robust attention to gender that for various reasons gets edited out. So that's something that I'm keeping in mind as part of this queer imagining of what women, peace, and security is and can be. And importantly, this agenda is linked up with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women and is very much connected up with civil society, as I mentioned, in terms of the NGO working group being this group of civil society organizations that are very much offering ways to continue to bring different issues forward, context-specific issues centered on the lived experiences of women and how it matters to think about their experiences in peace building, and not only just as survivors of violence, which, to be honest, has been a significant where a lot of the attention has gone. And I think we can relate to this in terms of how we get to talk about LGBTQ lives. A lot of this ends up being about talking about targeted violences. We see this as the narrative, that a really important narrative of Trans Day of Visibility, can we also talk about celebrating trans lives, talk about trans people as living, and also being able to help us think differently about how we're understanding concepts beyond vulnerability and violence. And I do want to situate the interventions I'm making here in the institutionalization of women, peace, and security. So we have this handbook on women, an Oxford handbook, which, you know, we can maybe we can map our various queer disciplines and see when we get the handbook and how we think about what that means about how it's being institutionalized. But there's the Oxford Handbook on Women, Peace, and Security. I was part of this New Directions in Women, Peace, and Security book, and I'm drawing a lot on feminist security studies scholarship. So Samita Basu, Cynthia Enlow, Anik Wiven, Laura Joberg, Laura Shepard, and also this emerging queer international relations work. Cindy Weber's Queer International Relations text being a key document or text there. But also, as I'm troubling through not just thinking about LGBTQ as inclusion, as addition, but what does it mean to actually queer how we think about security? I'm engaging with abolitionist thinking here about, and the really important engagements with securitization and pushback against securitization and policing in this scholarship. You know, Angela Davis, Dean Spade, Paul Amar's book has also been really foundational in terms of how I think about what does it mean to invite queer people into an architecture like this, and how does that mean that we also need to maybe envision women, peace, and security differently. So to speak to the interviews I did, so I spoke to 20 different women, peace, and security practitioners, and I was really guided by these questions, these curiosities about how people actually define women and how they define gender and these categories, which are often used interchangeably. And this is something that has troubled feminist scholars for a long time. It's certainly, again, not unique to women, peace, and security, but I do think it ends up feeding in really dangerously to the erasure of lesbian, bisexual, and trans experiences. And I also pose this question: do you think sexual orientation and gender identity is a part of gender, peace, and security work? Like, is this women, peace, and security? And a lot of people had not been asked that. I think most had not been thought about that. A lot had not been asked to think about the category women. And so I think that really reflects where women, peace, and security discourse is in terms of thinking beyond cis and het sort of assumptions, right? But I will say that when I started doing this work, I really did kind of come from a place where I thought it was because of homophobia and transphobia that there was this siloing out and sort of maybe erasure of experiences. And after having these conversations and being in the spaces a bit longer, I think that it echoes a lot more of the conversations that I expect other people who are doing intersectional work have faced, where it's certainly there's questions about funding. There's the question about whose responsibility is it to be responding to targeted violence against LGBTQ people. I mean, we're already busy enough trying to just respond to, you know, violence against women, right? But there's also a real question of expertise and who's in the position to be able to do this work. And I think that we can also talk about anti-racist work and how we think about what to do with that insecurity and that response. And so this is something that I'm just bringing with me as I continue to sort of evolve my thinking on how and whether to bring attention to LGBTQ people in these different spaces. But remembering that, you know, in 2009, we have the UN Deputy Secretary General saying that we really need to prevent the resolution from remaining simply words on paper and be able to use it as a tool to demand the protection and empowerment of women and girls. And there are certainly there's certainly people that, and you're welcome to ask the question in the audience, why are we still looking to the women, peace, and security architecture to be a place that's going to offer us solutions here? But I will say that I've seen a lot of different civil society spaces that do see it as a valuable tool, as a way, like not the only one and one with limitations, but one among others to be able to respond to sexism, to be able to highlight gendered experiences, women's experiences. And so, in 2016, I proposed these, what would be sort of my suggestion about ways to promote SOGI inclusion. So I argued including LGBTQ people in women, peace, and security projects, which is most often not happening, certainly at the international level. There's definitely questions about whether or not that's happening in different national action plans, which it is in some instances, or whether or not people are, obviously there's many cases where people are included and we don't know because they're not out and they're not invited to be out, or they don't feel like they can talk about sexuality openly, right? I proposed expanding the indicators because, how do we monitor the implementation of resolutions or policy in general, and in developing indicators has been a key component of that. So suggesting having sexual orientation and gender identity as a component of this. Importantly, really defining women and gender as distinct terms so that it's clear how, and if you do mean sexual orientation and gender identity, what that means as a part of this work. And then as so many people continue to highlight the need to actually collect data about LGBTQ people and not as a lump sum, as disaggregated, so that there's actually some attention to lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women. And I always encourage, if you don't ask those questions and you're not looking for that, please also tell me that, because part of my frustration came from, several 100-page documents that just wouldn't include the word lesbian at all. And that's just very frustrating and disappointing, right? But I think there's visibility is not necessarily the answer, right? This is not something that is, we're talking about conflict related environments, and there's certainly complexities to what sort of coalitions can come forward. But I do think that there's ways to be thinking differently about how to collect and share this information, right? And then I do propose engaging with the UN independent monitor for responding to violence. I think it's sexual orientation and gender identity, discrimination against people because of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I do believe they're going to, for the first time this year, actually release a report related to targeted violence in conflict, targeted violence against LGBTQ people and violence in conflict related environments. So turning to what are some of the ways that women, peace, and security is sort of measured as being implemented. So there's these key pillars, right? The participation, prevention, and protection, 3 Ps, and then this relief and recovery. So as I've been looking at these pillars of sort of how we see women, peace, and security, and what the hope of how women, peace, and security can sort of improve and include a gender perspective, I've been thinking about what does it mean to sort of queer these 3 different pillars, right? So in thinking about participation here, thinking about, as I suggested, SOGI inclusion, also including, as I said, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women in data about sexual and gender-based violence. And so to me, really, when I started thinking about women, peace, and security, it was because I was frustrated that there didn't seem to be attention to transphobia and homophobia as a type of gendered violence. And that is one, especially as we're seeing the gender ideology and the way that targeting LGBTQ people is actually very powerful in terms of state making, and for homophobia is because it continues to be really powerful tool in different ways. It seems a space, to say nothing of actually responding to the violence, it seems a real gap in understanding gendered violence and understanding how gender matters to peace and security. So then thinking about complicating the work of prevention. So recognizing that men are also perpetrators of SGBV against men. There's definitely been growing research about this. However, I do think a lot of it does tend to reproduce a binary of not really allowing a lot of space for well, queer survivors necessarily, but also just a complexity that of not just having, women who target men who are targeted, women who are targeted, instead sort of opening this up with a sort of a queer analysis, but also this queering, understanding prevention through the lens of centering queer experiences really does, I think, is a way to refute the danger of a narrow focus on wartime sexual and gender-based violence, because we know that there's a very different continuum of violence for people who are already sort of outside the ability to rely on the state for security. And so what does it mean to think about security differently, to think about violence differently, by also thinking about queer and trans people, right? And then recognizing women also as perpetrators of violence. And then in terms of, certainly it's related to the protection component, thinking about men as also being victims, thinking about homophobic and transphobic violence, and then having context-specific advocacy for protecting lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women in doing this work. And this is, I think, part of also highlighting this is to show that this is women, peace, and security work, because there are organizations that are doing this in different ways. Maybe it's not being called women, peace, and security work, right? So, and I'm also, so I'm sitting in Northern Ireland, and there's very active queer and feminist organizing here, underfunded, very active. And so when I'm thinking about the relief and recovery component of women, peace, and security, I'm myself, and along with colleagues in Colombia and South Africa, we're really thinking about what does it mean to queer peace building? What is queer peace building? And so supporting dialogues is certainly something that I've seen here in with some of the different civil society organizations in Northern Ireland, but also, and I'm thinking of this comment by Paisley Curra earlier in one of the seminars about sort of what's the most important thing that you can do for trans rights right now. And he was kind of like, well, I mean, it's sort of the same thing that you can do for everyone, right? Like, we need housing, we need, we need healthcare, we need access to basic resources. And I do think that we see queer and trans organizations doing this, prioritizing direct services, whether, certainly there's been the work for in crisis of mutual aid response, but also, I mean, there's a several year wait list for getting resources to trans healthcare in I think across the UK, but certainly here in Northern Ireland. And one might not frame that as a queering peace building issue, but I think in terms of relief and recovery and having a life of safety and dignity, you can't really separate those as being key components of it. I certainly see queer art and theater as a really powerful and important space for thinking about queer visions of what security and what peace looks like. And I'm also thinking a lot about the role of archives, and especially I think in post-conflict, there's a lot of contested dialogues, and then there's a lot of desire to unify them. And I think I can talk a bit about what we're seeing happening in Colombia, but we know that there's a real neoliberal desire to push it in the direction of positivity and simplify beyond complexity. And so I do think that developing archives that have the more complex stories, the way that there were conversations where in coalition it was decided to pursue a certain initiative over another, and what that complexity looks like, and how that could potentially inform other post-conflict peace building initiatives. And to me, that's a really necessary and important thing to be looking at right now as we're thinking about, as I said, I think the Colombian context is one where this is one that this is a topic that we're talking about a lot right now, because the Colombian peace process is being held up as like the most intersectional and the most inclusive, with LGBTQ organizations being a part of it. But I think that developing the archives is a space where you can have more queer stories, and those that maybe didn't make it to, you know, the formal spaces of who gets to sit at the table. Because I mean, certainly the women, peace and security agenda is a lot about who gets to sit at the table, who gets to be part of peace building. Women are not there, period, like usually. And that's an important thing to recognize. But how do we also, you know, in addition to documenting the inclusion narrative, how do we also tell the stories of resisting maybe the state's version, or the, you know, international story about what peace building needed to look like. And this space of refusing some of the really dangerous securitizing logics, absolutely built into women, peace and security, but also in you know, moving into what's considered peace in a way that can be within, you know, sovereign states and the international system. So some of the research, that some of the work I've been doing is as I said, moving beyond the system net assumptions, but also confronting the racial hierarchies that are reproduced in much of the women, peace and security work right now, which in some ways is a result of this institutionalization of women, peace and security. But it brings up these challenges of who's an expert and who's an activist, and who gets to be in those identities, and sort of how do we maybe challenge and resist those, the way that you know, people from the global south end up being activists, even if they have a freaking PhD, and, you know, have been doing the work for 15 years, you know. So how do we, and so with Tony Haster, I've written a couple of pieces talking about the way that in the push to institutionalize and have this work be taken seriously, having gender be taken seriously on the international stage, what have been the, you know, what racial hierarchies have been reproduced in this work through these, we write about the centers of excellence that have been established, which I could talk a bit about, and I'd be curious if this is resonating for other folks. And then, you know, this call for engagement with critical race scholarship, and, you know, the need to really, you know, we've got extensive work on decolonizing sexuality. So what does it mean to bring that work in, while also calling for attention to, you know, more than heterosexual women, right? And also recognizing that lesbians are women, right? So I did want to point to some of the civil society reports that have really influenced how I'm thinking about some of these questions. The International Alert report from 2017 about when merely existing is a risk. This Outright Action International report, which came out, is one of the earliest ones I think I've seen. Human Rights Watch has some reports as well. But the Orders of Prejudice is a translated text out of Colombia, which is looking, and I highly, really recommend this text on systemic crimes committed against LGBT people in the Colombian armed conflict, because I think it just really it is a powerful intersectional feminist look at the Colombian context, but also crimes of prejudice, which complicates thinking about homophobic and transphobic violence in a way that you're talking about. This is a form of violence that is also symbolic, right? And as I mentioned, the 2016 Colombian peace process is one that is now really being held up as a place like, let's study, let's understand how we got LGBT inclusion in this process. But and you know, I'm holding up Colombia Diversa as one of these organizations that was a key part of it, and the gender subcommittee is the reason that there was this intersectional work, although we understand, of course, there was a lot of work prior to this peace process, and also when the vote for the peace accords was put to the public, it failed. And so this has been part of the larger discourse on anti-gender backlash. So while on the one hand, it's being held up as this space, this place to study for inclusivity, intersectionality, and we also have to, or at least in the work I'm doing, I'm also trying to contend with the fact that you now see a rise in increased targeted violence against women human rights defenders. I did want to note that in 2018, Outright joined the NGO working group. So, while I'm writing my dissertation here, Outright, well, I guess as I was finishing my dissertation, this happened, which was exciting to see. It was, having Outright join the NGO working group and sort of really draw attention to LGBTQ rights as a part of women, peace, and security, I think was an important moment, as was, I like to share this quote from Sophia. So there's also a youth, peace, and security agenda. And Sophia says, we must change the narrative of young people as passive victims and young men as perpetrators while ignoring trans youth. Young women and trans youth are already doing incredible peace building work. So find us, support us, and fund us. And so I do think that the youth, peace, and security space is one where there is more open attention to sexual orientation and gender identity, making that direct link to gender, peace, and security work. And this is something that I've been with QUB since 2019, and more people are wanting to look at sexual orientation and gender identity in conflict-related research. So I'm really thinking about my role as a supervisor for this work, right? So I'm working on sort of maybe a best practices document or something that I can share. I'd really love people to maybe share a bit either now or we can connect later about, how they advise and support, because I don't think it's, I mean, I think the vulnerabilities, sensitivities, and commitments that one should be having in this work is not specific to conflict related research with queer communities, right? But I'm arguing that it's really important to work with local LGBTQ organizations. I'm pushing for actually, and this is not, I mean, I did start imagining this as something to like guide advising, but I'm also thinking for the policy work that is happening, that it's important to ask questions around sexual orientation and gender identity, and there's resources for doing this, right? So I'd like to highlight that. And I do think it matters to be very intentionally inclusive of LGBTQ individuals. So to signal this as you're to invite people to be open about their sexuality if this is something they feel comfortable doing, because I do think in the research I've done, there's been resistance where people say, well, it's really not safe to talk about that. And I think that we know from queer communities, it needs to be a bit more complicated than that. People can tell you a little bit more about what's safe or not if you invite that. As I've already said, I think it's important to be explicit about defining gender. And then I'll just end on this note from one of the researchers who did that Orders of Prejudice report, which is translated to English. It's really important to translate and support in-country research. And this, again, not specific to women, peace, and security work, not specific to gender, peace, and security, but I think that this is something that I'm really trying to be encourage and find ways to engage with in terms of supporting translation, co-authoring, things like that. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that. And I really appreciate any questions and to have the opportunity to engage with you about my research.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for this very impressive and relevant presentation, very timely. Well, thank you. If you want to ask a question, please send me a message. You don't need to write your question, just send me your name so I know you want to ask the question. And I'm going to start by asking a question. Jamie, could you tell us a bit more, like give us some background about the specific threats and violence that LGBTQ people face in conflict, and specifically lesbian, bi, and trans women, how the discrimination and the violence that they may already be experiencing in a non-conflict environment, how does that get amplified, and how these women, LGBTQ women and LGBTQ people are especially targets of violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this links up with, especially thinking through the gender, peace, and security lens, we're thinking about misogyny and patriarchy, and then what it means when you can't actually be potentially open about your sexuality. So I do think in a lot of places there are not organizations to be working with to have community, open community with LGBTQ people. So a lot of these are the, you know, the double marginalization, right? So there's already significant targeted sexual and gender-based violence during conflict. And then when there's the, as I was talking about earlier, sort of the way that in certain spaces targeting queer people can be a mobilizing tactic in ways that are really understudied. I'm currently working with Meredith Loken to look at how non-state actors use this, because there's most of the violence is sort of appealing to states to sort of respond to, or to the international community to respond to homophobic states, right? But there's a lot of other on the ground ways that targeting, you know, I think there's the way that I think a lot of people are displaced in ways that are not captured and understood, because how do you capture violence about communities that cannot openly talk about their identity? And so I think that requires different ways to think about what counts as conflict-related violence. And I do think that feminist queer scholarship helps us see that. So I do think some, you know, there's the sexual and gender-based violence, there's the displacement, but then there's also the, what we do see more of the documentation of is the public targeting and killing of LGBTQ people that is meant to, and then as a result, people leaving and being displaced because they don't feel comfortable being there anymore. But I also think realistically, we don't actually know the shape of this in a lot of spaces. we don't know the shape of what this violence looks like. And so, you know, you can look at the International Action report, which does have more details about how people are vulnerable because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. But in terms of being able to have detailed accounts to compare across different contexts, I would say to put it, yeah, it's under researched, under reported.
Okay, thank you. Ammar Azuz, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Jamie. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for this presentation, and nice to see you again. We had chat this week. So the question is actually something that we touched on in our conversation, but in many situations where there's conflict, and I'm thinking of where I'm from in Syria, there's quite a lot of interest in LGBTQ plus communities to do something, but then let's say their circles or people who are around them in exile, they would say it's not your time now. So they feel that they are pushed again and again from their own communities, even in exile. And even though they want to fight for the same cause, a collective cause, not about their own right, but about everyone's right, they are pushed away. So I wanted to ask you, like, how can we resist this, especially that you mentioned that there are more people are interested in doing things about queer communities at a time of conflict. And I think there's quite a lot to do, but very often these voices are further marginalized. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, thank you for that question. And I mean, I have to say, like, the interest that when I started doing, so I started publishing on this in 2016, and now I'm definitely being brought into policy spaces to sort of, okay, tell us why we need to think about queer people as a part of feminist foreign policy, why we need to be thinking about it as a part of women, peace, and security. And I do think that there is a real need for networking among people who are in exile, right? Because actually what ends up happening to a lot of LGBTQ people, as you're saying, is people are in exile, they leave, they can't be there anymore. So where is the community? Where are these people that we can sort of learn with, learn from? And I do think that part of, you know, it's hard for me not, I'm very frustrated about the ways that academia sort of packages how we can gather this research and share it, because I think it actually does need to be slow. I think it does require collaboration. I think it does potentially, I think there's a real opportunity for having collectives, right? Having collectives where people who maybe cannot individually sort of report out or share could be working in coalition together. But I do think that there's a responsibility and an opportunity to help support that networking, and I'm seeing more interest. I'm seeing more interest in helping to facilitate that. But I guess for me, there's a real palpable need for a community of practice, I guess, these are the words that kind of keep coming up as sort of, how do we facilitate a community of practice for people who are able to speak about their own experiences, but also call on researchers and call on policymakers to, to be informed by queer and trans people who can speak to what needs to be done in Syria. And so I do think that there's a space right now to sort of ask, to be making make demands of, okay, organizations want to take an action, here's what needs to happen. So I see it as, and so with my work, a lot of it is back to women, peace and security practitioners, and sort of, okay, reflecting on the implementation and sort of those that are in the more privileged positions. If you're a cis white woman who is, a gender advisor who's able to sit in these rooms and sort of bring up these, I think it just sort of resonates that we can't have all the queer Muslim survivors of conflict be the ones that are expected to speak about being a queer Muslim survivor of conflict. That's not reasonable. But how do we support sharing these insights from survivors in a way that doesn't feel extractive, to put it bluntly. And so I guess I don't necessarily know what that looks like, but I do know that there is a moment and a call for, as I said, I think there is a real moment and a call for establishing a community of practice that can make those sort of demands and insist on this is what it should look like going forward, because it's not sustainable as it is. I mean, from the conversation we had and the conversations you've had, it feels like a moment of real need for real reflection on ethical practices and how to move through this if the international community really does want to take up some of these questions and respond, right? But yeah, I'm curious what other people think as well. But yeah, this is a longer conversation that I definitely see myself like in for the long haul to continue how we respond to this, right?
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Pippa Catterall.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that talk, and the thing I most responded to was the idea that sexual and gender-based violence is one of the ways in which states have engaged in processes of state building. That using that kind of and of course, the root of the word nation is natio, which is all about childbirth and so on. And when you're targeting people who are not associated with heteronormative forms of replicating the nation, it's one way of reinforcing what the nation is. So I thought that was a really interesting and rich insight, which I find is absent from most of IR literature, because they usually talk about states as legal persons rather than as collectivities which represent whole groups of people who are often very diverse. One of my problems with the resolution with which you started is that it has the overtone of a kind of modernist project of, well, all these men are already talking about it. Let the girls have a place at the table as well, and we'll bring a different perspective. And you think, that's actually not terribly ambitious. That really what we should be doing is say, we need a totally different perspective. I mean, basically, all we're doing is saying, when you have this male-based violence, because let's face it, most of it is male-based violence, occasionally women should be able to talk about it as well. Whereas what perhaps we need to do is queer the whole thing. and undermine the way in which patriarchy is built into this whole process. And it seems to me that just having that resolution, what we're leaving is the heteronormativity which is practiced by so many states in place, and not queering it. And in a sense, what you're talking about is saying, well, let's have the queers there as well.
Yeah.
But that's just sort of playing the same game rather than let's try and have a different agenda. So I suppose what I'm really asking is, if we were going to have a queer IR, which looked at it from a totally different perspective and started off by saying, okay, people are really diverse. Let's just deal with that. And let's forget about states, because all they are social constructs and legal constructs anyway. And let's start from, how do we include people into societies? Would we get a totally different perspective, or are we so stuck into the structures inherited from the 20th century that we can't queer them?
Yeah, I mean, you raised so many important questions, and so many that I definitely am grappling with on a daily basis. So, I mean, one of the questions, there's the question, should there be a resolution specifically on sexual orientation and gender identity? I'm going to say no, please don't. But that's the thing that gets floated, right? Like, we end up talking about, well, what would it mean to have, like, or the 11th resolution is now specifically around sexual orientation and gender identity. Also, why, so part of the reason of that it's held up as being so important is like, okay, we're getting legitimacy because we're in the Security Council. And I definitely think a queer feminist critique is sort of like, do we want legitimacy through this violent colonial institution? Is that really progress? And I'm doing my best to hold the both and of, like, I do think it's important to have people sit in these spaces and say lesbians or women and sexuality is part of how we need to be thinking about gender. I do think that's important. I do think, though, that it has reified really problematic essentialist ideas about why we need women there and which women get to be there. And it's so much work that as someone who's the equality officer at an academic institution right now, I can just say I'm having a lot of reflection on where the right places to be making interventions are. We can have a conversation about that, right? So I think, so I do think that there's also this wave of, where is women, peace, and security happening? Do we have to have it be the Security Council? Can we not sort of say, okay, yes, this was part of it, but actually, because, there's national action plans, there's definitely civil society activists that they're like, end goal is not like, I need to speak at the UN Security Council, right? Like, although that is sort of that is the hierarchy, right? Like, the value is that women as civil society activists get to speak at the Security Council and legitimize women as being part of peace building too. And we need to count, literally, so much of the implementation is counting how many women. And, is that queer progress? And so many of these reports have women in fatigues on the cover. And that is definitely not like the queer future of progress and like radical liberation that like I'm excited about in doing this work. But I do think that if there's funding that's responding to sexual and gender-based violence, I do think it's important to have someone writing into the documents, like, not everyone's straight, and we need to be thinking about these other forms of violence. So I think that it is sort of like, how do we strategize across these different spaces? How do we mobilize and build on the queer feminist work that's been working through the UN spaces and these different spaces of intervention? And when is it not the right time to be putting the energies into that? Because, we literally had the word gender, the US refusing the word gender in like the resolution in 2019. And then you end up passing resolutions that are really heteronormative and very predictably so, because I don't think that everyone who's working on I know that not everyone working on these resolutions thinks in heteronormative, limited binary ways. But as you go through the process of consultation, what gets edited out, and then what are we left to deal with? Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, a lot more to say there, but I think I picked up on. We should connect. Let's talk more.
Okay, thank you. So we still have 2 questions, and first let's hear from Cordelia Bristol, please.
Thank you so much. That had a great talk. I was really curious about how discussions around gender liminality are happening and folks that fall outside of Western constructions of identity, especially from a concept of folks that are negatively impacted by colonialism, plus kind of medicalization when it comes to gender and these cultures that are already being negatively impacted by kind of the state in general. How are conversations about folks like this happening, especially within the concepts of like data and definition that you need to make change in these kind of structural spaces?
I can just say from my experience, I don't know of them happening in terms of people who are collecting information about sexual and gender-based violence for the most part, I think. Yeah, I mean, you can't collect information about LGBTQ as a category. I mean, what does that mean? That's nonsense. But when I do see it, and that's sort of why, you know, to the earlier question, you need to clear the whole process, right? You can't just like, and then bring in an LGBTQ organization to like review your report. I mean, lost cause at that point, right? And I think that's also why I find in some ways, the turn to like recognize men as survivors too has also turned, I mean, maybe this is resonating with you, turned into sort of like reifying binary categories of violence in ways that are really frustrating. So I think that, you know, the UN had its first event where UN Women was a part of it, recognizing that diverse sexualities. I mean, we know that queer people who work at UN and different institutions are having these conversations. We know they embody these diverse identities, right? So whether or not it's translating to text, whether or not it's being, I do think that there's smaller civil society organizations that are collecting information with the, you know, complexity of diverse sexualities written in, you know, like fine, have a whole page that explains context specific identities and lived experiences. I do think that in the reports I've seen, for the most part, that end up making it to sort of like the international stage, it's like a footnote or like a right next to disability, the like LGBTQ. I mean, so so I do think that space is opening up to ask for more and to insist on more, but I haven't seen that translate yet. And again, I'm looking at what's in English, what's presented at the international level, right? Like there's definitely more complex work that's happening in country, not translated out, not really, I mean, because if we're querying this, who's the work for? Do we really need the UN system to be part of queer liberation? I mean, like these are I'm happy that, you know, like I think we need to be having these. Are there not like really radical ways to be doing regional work to support queer communities and also like borders, like are not necessarily, you know, the limited sovereignty, the limited thinking of state sovereignty as a way to sort of visualize out of post-conflict is not the same way that certainly people who are already living in a experience of exile are going to be framing liberation, right?
Okay, thank you. I have time for one more question from Phil Crea.
Hi, thanks so much. And sorry if you address this in the first few minutes. I came a little bit late. It's a question on data. So if we look at these issues through the eyes of the institutions, the global institutions that work on it, I tend to think that they have gotten the message that better disaggregated, better intersectional data is needed, but there's just no follow through. There's no political will to do so. So for example, I was on a webinar with a donor government to the humanitarian sector quite recently. And like their response to the question that, you know, the community was being excluded from humanitarian work was to do better like data collection and diagnostics, right? But absolutely no follow through, absolutely no way to operationalize that, absolutely no way of saying we have the political will to make that happen. It's just, it's end of conversation. So I'm wondering, like, with your points on data collection, how do we actually get those institutions and their funders like held accountable to the messaging that they say is important? That's the first part. And then the second part, also data related, is Can you recommend any good data sets that have done this, both in terms of good ethical safeguards, but also like good cutting edge methodologies that allowed the issue to be captured much better?
Yeah, well, for the first question, I do think that at least how I've been trying to approach it, part of it is talking about people doing the implementing, because the way as I see it with women, peace, and security, so much of that, it does come down to the actual practice of how you think about gender and how you think about women and how you're approaching the work you do, and how that will then translate into qualitative and quantitative reporting on what's happening. So I see it, that's why I end up emphasizing like the definitions that are used as central to how you're thinking about the work you're doing, because you cannot, I don't think, meaningfully, because I don't think institutions are centrally thinking about queerness as being important to how you think about gender at all, right? Like they are maybe at a place where they'll put LGBTQ or they'll write intersectionality, but that is not translating into practice. So I think until it is actually taken seriously, that I mean, there's a real danger in saying you'll understand heterosexual women's experiences better if you also like center LGBTQ lives. It is true, though. It is true that we can understand gender and patriarchy if we actually learn from and with queer communities. And until, because you know the difference in a project, like if Estrella writes a report about gender in Peru, you know, there is one now, Pasha-Boyna-Jansen just wrote it. That's a very different report than a report that's coming out that's not, you know, centering the experiences of lesbian feminist organizing. So I do think that you're up a creek if you're trying to fix that problem sort of after you've already established what the project is that you're doing. So I do think in some ways it's central to sort of like how we're defining the work that we're doing. And then I guess the short answer to the second one is no, but I don't know any. And I think I still sort of, I guess it depends on which, I think in IR and poli-sci, I don't think with a lot of the women, peace, and security work, I don't, there's the question of like the first wave of like case making that like queer people are important too when we need to look at this violence, right? I do think that there's that, right? And I think maybe we're at a place now, I think it's important to show the limitations of the way that information is being gathered. So that's sort of in some ways how Meredith Loken and I are approaching like the systems that you have to explain patterns of violence are not capturing this at all. And so to me, I think having the qualitative information that explains like, here's pockets of information we have about how we understand this targeted violence happening is important to then maybe think differently about how you see and report and gather information about violence. But let's continue talking about that, because this is truly a conundrum, right?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jamie, for your presentation, and thank you for the important work that you're doing. And thank you everyone for attending today. We'll be back next week, and Reynolds will be back, and Pippa Catterall is going to present on queer spaces. So see you in a week. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.